Hello, my name is Zachary Davis, and today I'll be presenting the Culper ring, aka Washington spies. Alright, so in October 1778, the 13 colonies, or the Americans, I'm going to refer to them as the Americans, were in the midst of war with their rulers, the British Empire. And the biggest British Empire stronghold was New York City at the time. So, Washington needed some intelligence from New York City so he can figure out what the heck the British are doing, so he can have a upper hand on the British and continue this war and fight for freedom, of course. So, some key people to remember from the Culper ring, was, George Washington, of course. He was the leader of the revolutionary people, the Americans at the time. The leader of the Culper ring and who started the Culper ring was Major Benjamin Talmadge. He was a dragoon in the revolutionary forces, and he eventually recruited Abraham Woodhull, who was a friend back in the good old days of Setauket, New York, which is in Long Island. And eventually Woodhull would have to recruit Robert Townsend, who was in New York City at the time, for his information. And then Caleb Brewster was basically the courier between Woodhull and Talmadge. And then also I'll be referring Woodhull and Townsend as their aliases as well, where Woodhull was Samuel Culper Sr. and Robert Townsend was Samuel Culper Jr. All right. So, how it worked was, once Woodhull was recruited, he would use the fake term of, or not fake, he would go visit his sister in New York City where she lived with her husband. And while he was there visiting, he would gather information about the British, their supply fleets, the troops that were in New York City, just anything, general knowledge that they needed to know in New York because they didn't have any eyes there. From there, he would take his information and ride back to his home in Setauket, New York, which you can see is at the point of that map, and he would write and code and letters to Benjamin Talmadge. From there, he would pass it on to Brewster, who would row or sail across the Long Island Sound and then ride to Talmadge, where Talmadge would pass off his information to General Washington. Eventually, British information was, or some British intelligence came down that there was a spy operating in Setauket, aka Woodhull. So Abraham Woodhull got lucky and he recruited Robert Townsend, where Townsend was a store operator in New York City at the time, and so he could gather information and write anonymous note or some notes as his alias to his alias father, aka Abraham Woodhull. So Townsend would gather information and write encode letters to his fake dad, I guess, Abraham Woodhull, where a courier would take it to New York and then pass it on to Abraham Woodhull. Woodhull would then pass that information and maybe add more information to Brewster, and Brewster would also add information and pass it on to Talmadge in Washington. So, moving along, does that make sense, I hope? Eventually, this system became so successful that they didn't want to lose it. So Talmadge had to create his own code system, which was just a series of numbers, which, I mean, if anyone got just a piece of paper with random numbers, no one would understand what's going on. And he created this system and wrote in this tiny little book. On the slide, you could see that's like an example of one of the pages that they found. And only 4 books were created for Talmadge, Washington, Woodhull, and Townsend. And so they would write in these codes and then they would pass it on to each other. And so you can imagine it would take probably hours to decode a letter, and it would prevent any British from understanding. One of the Culper Ring's most successful missions was discovering the treason of Benedict Arnold. He was in cahoots with the British intelligence officer John Andre in eventually giving up West Point to the British and basically splitting the 13 colonies in half, New England and the rest, basically. But John Andre was caught in American territory, and Talmadge was actually one of the people that caught him and stopped him from moving along because he was in disguise. And Andre was eventually discovered to be Andre, and was later revealed that the Culper Ring, they had been finding out information that that there was a high-ranking American officer about to cede to the other side, and they discovered that was Benedict from Andre, if that makes sense. Sorry if that was confusing. Eventually the war would come to an end in 1783, and that's when the Culper Ring was disbanded because the British were no more. And Washington saw it as a great success, and we actually didn't, as historians, we didn't find out about it until 1930, about this great spy ring. But, I mean, from then on out, it's been used as great knowledge to Americans and spies, as a great example of a success story of how spies were succeeded. Whew. And these are my sources. Thank you very much for listening.